Just back from China, the emboldened dictator Putin is launching a new phase of the war against Ukraine. The Times reports that the main government building in Kyiv was attacked during the conclusion of the Russian leaders' summit with Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un in Beijing. And his trademark brazenness is becoming increasingly noticeable. But American President Donald Trump, who promised to end the war in 24 hours, has not been able to and is unlikely to be able to counter Putin's brazenness. As Western analysts note, Trump made a huge mistake regarding Putin. United States President Donald Trump's belief that he could, by the force of his personality, convince the Kremlin dictator Putin to agree to a peace deal was, at best, overly flattering to himself and to the citizens. In practice, Putin received from Xi Jinping only support for his war against Ukraine, and assurances that Beijing would not let Moscow lose this war. Well, and Trump only threatens new sanctions, which it seems will never actually happen. My name is Alexei Pechi. It's September 9th on the calendar. Let's discuss this topic together. What Putin got from Xi Jinping, why he's more confident, and why he's beginning a new phase of the war against Ukraine. But before we begin, I want to remind you that every day on this YouTube channel, several news analysis segments are released, so that you can stay up to date with absolutely all the news. That's why I recommend subscribing to this YouTube channel and liking this video. Also subscribe to my Telegram channel Peachy News, the link to it is in the description of this video. So, the President of Russia, Vladimir Putin, has just completed his trip to Beijing aimed at building trust and meeting with Chairman Xi Jinping. When did Moscow launch its largest air attack of the entire war against Ukraine? On Sunday, as Kyiv's anti-aircraft guns tried to deal with waves of Russian drones and missiles, there were over 800 drones alone, the main government building, the Cabinet of Ministers, was attacked, causing a fire to break out on the upper floors. This was the first time since Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022 that a Ukrainian government building was attacked. Hardliners in Moscow have long been urging the Kremlin to strike so-called decision-making centers in Ukraine. Well, and in November, Putin warned that they could become targets for Russian missiles. But until Trump entered the White House, Putin still understood that with each new wave of escalation, the United States was supplying Ukraine with increasingly powerful weapons. Now it's possible to attack Ukraine without any restraints at all. The United States won't respond to this in any way anyway. And, as the Times writes today, although it's still unclear whether the building was hit directly or by debris from the drone's missile, there's a temptation to see the fire in the Cabinet of Ministers, which destroyed the offices of Ukrainian government ministers, as a symbol of a new stage in Russia's war against Ukraine. Although he never suffered from a lack of self-confidence, Putin's characteristic brazenness became noticeably stronger after his return from Beijing, where, according to him, Russia's relationship with China is at an unprecedentedly high level. Putin, Xi Jinping, and the North Koreans. The Korean dictator Kim Jong-un also took part in the large-scale military parade in the Chinese capital. This was the first meeting between the leaders of China, Russia, and North Korea since the Cold War began. Putin was given a seat to the right of Xi Jinping, which analysts believe was meant to emphasize the special relationship between them. Although China, unlike North Korea, has not sent troops to Ukraine, it supports the Kremlin diplomatically and challenges the West. The Kremlin, unlike North Korea, does not send troops to Ukraine but supports North Korea. China also plans to reopen its domestic bond market to major Russian companies for the first time since the start of Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine. And today there was news that Beijing agreed to lend its yuan to Putin to save the gas giant Gazprom. When asked on Friday who will prevail in the world in the future, the East or the West, Putin replied that it will be multipolarity. Multipolarity refers to dividing the world into distinct spheres of influence. The Kremlin has long been striving for this, but although Beijing's position here is different, the world will not be multipolar but bipolar, with two centers of influence in Beijing and Washington. But something else matters to us. Unlike the first months of President Trump's second term, the Kremlin no longer even tries to pretend that they are interested in a peace agreement. On Friday, Putin warned that Russia might target and destroy Western peacekeepers if they are deployed. He once again stated his readiness to meet with Ukrainian President Zelensky, but only if the Ukrainian leader comes to Moscow, which Kyiv has ruled out as an impossible option. Putin's trip to Beijing took place shortly after Trump rolled out the red carpet for him in Alaska at the Russian-American summit, which many consider a diplomatic triumph for Moscow, but not for Trump. On Sunday, the United States president made a statement. Putin said he plans to speak with Putin again in the coming days and warned of his intention to impose additional sanctions against Moscow if Putin does not agree to a peace agreement. United States Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said that tough sanctions could completely collapse the Russian economy. We've heard this before. Apparently, Trump gave Putin another 2 weeks. However, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said on Monday that sanctions will not make Russia abandon the war. Trump's previous threats to take tough economic measures against Russia did not lead to any concrete actions. That's why in Moscow they just laugh at threats from the American president. Peskov also stated that Putin's attempts to explain the root causes of the war on the international stage are bearing fruit. He didn't go into details, but I'll explain that these so-called root causes refer to the Kremlin's labeling of the pro-Western government in Kyiv, which Moscow considers a threat to its national identity. On Monday, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz warned that Putin's imperialist plan will not end with the conquest of Ukraine, but will rather be just the beginning. And he added, quote, "What we call the liberal world order is under pressure from many sides, including within the political West." Last week, in a phone conversation with European leaders, Trump stated that they, that is, the European leaders, are financing the war by purchasing Russian energy resources. The main European consumers of Russian oil are Hungary and Slovakia, whose leaders support Donald Trump. At the same time, the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine, Oleksandr Syrsky, stated that the Russian invasion army has up to a 6-fold superiority in forces and resources on the battlefield. However, he also noted that Ukraine has undermined Moscow's ability to produce fuel and lubricants for its war machine. And last month, strikes were carried out on 60 targets on Russian territory. But today, cable news network writes that United States President Donald Trump's belief that he could use the force of his personality to convince the Kremlin dictator Vladimir Putin to agree to a peace deal was, at best, overly flattering both to himself and to the head of the Kremlin. This confidence was fueled by the hasty strategic conclusion that Moscow could become a potential ally of the United States against China, rather than increasingly turning into an energy and raw materials vassal of Beijing. It is reported that this is a mistake. The usual interpretation has cost Ukraine dearly, very dearly, both in terms of shaky public support from the United States and in giving Russia a window of opportunity for a slow advance of its troops on the front. However, Washington eventually did learn some obvious and valuable lessons, but I'm afraid it was too late. The ruthless Russian airstrikes on Kyiv actually reflect the result of Russian diplomacy reaching a dead end. Moscow clearly doesn't want peace, as shown by the strike on Ukraine's cabinet of ministers. And regardless of whether this happened intentionally or was the result of falling debris from intercepted drones or missiles, this happened after another strike that hit the offices of the European Union and the British Council in Kyiv. So even if we assume that it was just debris that fell on the cabin, before that there were targeted strikes that hit the offices of the European Union and the British Council in Kyiv. And as terrible as it sounds, the death of Ukrainian children seems to be the only thing that truly moves Donald Trump. However, it is already obvious that Putin, having received a 6-month window of time, is not even trying to appease Donald Trump in any way. That's why the United States President's special envoy, Kit Kellogg, rightly called the latest attacks an escalation. Analysts say this is no coincidence. Last week, Putin returned from Beijing, where he received demonstrative support from Xi Jinping, who is eager to show the world his own unyielding bloc. This only strengthened the feeling in Moscow that the road ahead is still long and it's time to get ready for the journey. And as cable news network writes, quote, "The outlook for the coming months is grim. Putin may convert the pressure of his troops in eastern Ukraine into a territorial gain of strategic significance. Trump, on the other hand, will likely face the difficulty of coming up with an economic response that is painful enough for Moscow to change its course, but still soft enough to keep diplomatic channels open. But, as for me, that's completely impossible. Well, partly because of Trump's own convoluted thinking, as he wants to strike, but also not to strike. But mainly because Putin simply doesn't want any peace. He doesn't want it. And that's why the past 8 months of Trump's presidency have been wasted by the United States president in terms of preparing for Ukraine's survival and ensuring European security. The pointless rapprochement with Moscow and the undermining of the transatlantic alliance, which Washington will still need in the future, have only made things worse. But they have provided an invaluable lesson to the new Trump administration. Therefore, even Trump can have no illusions now. And if he still has them now, I don't even know what could possibly open the eyes of the American president. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's all. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone. Subtitles